And I'll hand straight over to Lucy to introduce the session.
Thanks, Colin, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I see a few new faces. So we're Bedfordshire Climate Change Forum. If you're not familiar with what we do, amongst other things, monthly talks and film screenings, and obviously for the last 18 months, those have been online, and we continue to do them online. In the last few months, we've had talks on everything from agriculture to hydrogen, energy, carbon tax. We've had authors from local areas and also from further afield. And we're really pleased tonight to welcome Jeremy Williams. So Jeremy's a Luton-based author. Some of you I know are from Luton, so you'll probably be familiar with him as an environmental campaigner, as an author and a blogger. One of the reasons we wanted to invite Jeremy particularly was because in the aftermath of COP as a committee, we were reflecting on the failure of commitment in loss and damage in compensation to people who have suffered greatly already because of climate change and the ones who have done least to cause it. And Colin, I think Colin actually bumped into Jeremy, who he knows at a recent protest. I think it was a Global Day of Action, wasn't it, in the run up to COP? And we thought we must have Jeremy. And then we heard that, or I heard that he'd written a book, Climate Change is Racist, which he will talk to you about. So I will hand over to Jeremy. Before I do, just a reminder, please do use the chat. Sometimes we mute the chat, but we've decided not to mute the chat. So you can put in questions at any point in the chat. Please keep muted though. But we prefer not to have conversations in the chat because we think it can be a bit distracting, and we want to sort of give Jeremy our full attention. And then when he's finished, we will look at the chat and draw out questions. So any questions you have will be answered and we can discuss. Okay, thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Good evening. It's nice to see a bunch of you here and to have an opportunity to speak to you. Those of you who have heard me speak before, maybe in Luton a couple of weeks ago, some of this material might sound familiar. Hope you don't mind. Just to say a little bit about the way we'd like to do things, I'm going to talk for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions after that and see how many we can get through. To kick off with just a little bit about myself and how I came to this topic. I grew up in Madagascar and in Kenya, and so from an early age I got to see firsthand environmental issues such as deforestation and soil erosion and the effects of natural disasters like cyclones and forest fires up close, and saw how they affected those who had the least. And when I grew up and went to university and found out about climate change for the first time, I could straight away see how this was a justice issue because it would affect people like those I'd grown up around in Madagascar who had so little to begin with. And the effects of natural disasters and climate change on those sorts of people were going to be so much worse than they were in a rich country like this one. So I understood climate change as a justice issue. The particular and specific racial dimension to that came much later. It wasn't something that I'd heard anyone talk about. And that's not because nobody was talking, it's because I hadn't heard them. That's all it was. And once I kind of realized that there was something going on there, I found this whole kind of rabbit hole of environmental justice that I've been exploring over the last couple of years. And that's resulted in this book, Climate Change is Racist, Race Privilege and the Struggle for Climate Justice. It's a little book, you can read that. Don't be intimidated by it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that this evening. There was a particular moment when I realized that there was a racial inequality to climate change. And that's when I saw these two maps side by side for the first time. I'd seen both of them separately, but not next to each other before. And when I put them side by side for this report I was writing, it kind of jumped out at me. So I show this to everybody who I do talks for. So some of you will have seen this before, but I'm going to show you those two maps. So we'll go to the share screen here. And hopefully that will work. Okay, so the first map that I want to show you is a map of carbon emissions per capita. You've probably seen something like this before. It shows where in the world people have the highest carbon footprints. So on this map, those countries in red have the highest footprints, and then you've got the yellow and orange in the middle, and then countries with the smallest carbon emissions are the green ones. So the darker the green, the smaller the carbon footprints. The green countries are the ones that have contributed the least to climate change. And the countries in red are the ones that are most responsible for it. There are some outliers on this map. I'll draw your attention to China, which is big in yellow there. Now we know that China is the world's biggest emitter as a total of the whole country, but on a per capita basis, per person, carbon emissions are fairly low, actually, kind of on a par with much of Europe. Mongolia, just above it, is like the darkest red, like it looks like the worst country in the world. That's because they have a lot of coal and a very small population. So it's not quite as bad as it potentially looks on this map. Now, map number 2. This is a map of climate vulnerability, and it's measured by Notre Dame University in the States, and it shows where climate change is going to hurt most. So here, green indicates relative safety. And with climate change as a global issue, it's always relative, but it's relative safety. And then orange to red shows mounting risk. So it's those orange and red countries, particularly the darker red countries, that we can consider to be the front line of climate change, if you like. And if we put the two side by side, you can see that they're almost negatives of each other. There's this green band across the middle in the first one, and then it flips over and the green is at the top and bottom. And what we see here is that there's a really stark disconnect between the causes of climate change and the consequences of climate change. The people who've caused it are not the people who have to live with it, to put it in its most basic terms. And that's the injustice of climate change. That's why people talk specifically about climate justice. And there's different elements to that. There's multiple dimensions to climate justice, and we can see several of them on these two maps. One of the most basic ones, it's funny how little it gets mentioned in some ways, but it's just a matter of geography. So if you think about hot and cold countries, you know, the equator, the temperate regions, obviously global warming is going to mean a lot more in a country which is already very warm. So if you're in Somalia or Sudan, global warming is more scary than if you're in Finland or in Sweden. We have the luxury of living in a temperate part of the world, and we don't feel that same kind of threat that we might feel if we lived in an arid country. And I'm struck sometimes at the way we draw the world, and you'll have seen images like this on placards at protests and on NGO logos and on the front covers of climate change books and so on. This two-tone earth of blue and green. And of course, the world doesn't look like that. If we look at the world from space, it looks more like this. And the differences between those two are that, one, there's no clouds on that first one. It's just an inanimate blob. And the second one is that not all the world is green. Not all the ground is green. And if you think about what climate change means in the green parts of the world, and what it means in the sandy parts of the world, and what it means in the white areas, the top and bottom of the globe, you realize that climate change is going to be a very different experience for different people. Up in the Arctic, you have Arctic communities who are already being profoundly challenged, really, in their way of life by climate change. Global warming concentrates at the poles, so they've actually had more warming than the rest of us have had so far. And that means that their whole way of life has been completely disrupted. Traditional foods, traditional hunting patterns, those sorts of things are just already breaking down. And there's a book by the activist Sheila Watt-Cloutier called The Right to be Cold, which describes this really well. So the colder areas of the world are being affected worse than others. And then, of course, those dry areas where you have expanding deserts and deforestation and drought, and then potentially famine through climate change. Very different for us here in the temperate part of the world, where we are relatively safer. So there's a geographical injustice here. If we look at our map comparison, we can see a second form of injustice here, and that's an economic one. there's a very clear rich and poor divide to climate change. If we look at the countries on that first map there that are in the dark red, other than Mongolia, which is an outlier, you see that by and large, those are wealthier countries that are red and orange. Some countries moving in the right direction in Europe, but certainly in North America and Australia, huge carbon emissions. And the countries where footprints are smallest are some of the poorest countries in the world, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular. We know how this works. If the more money you have, the more likely you are to jump on a plane or to have air conditioning in your house, to drive a big car, those sorts of things. So naturally, you are going to have a larger carbon footprint. Some of the people who have the smallest carbon footprints in the world have very little by way of energy use or material possessions. This is really quite a stark difference as well. And I want to draw that out with this particular comparison. Two countries that I have a connection to. Madagascar, where I grew up, people have an average carbon footprint of 0.16 tons per person per year. And in Australia, people have 16 tons per person per year. Far too much coal and driving going on in Australia. But to put that another way, it takes 100 Malagasy people to have the same impact on the planet as just one Australian. So the injustice here between rich and poor is no small thing. It's a factor of 100 in places. It's really quite dramatic. If you've been following the news at all, you'll know that there's a drought in Madagascar. Like all droughts, it's quite complicated, but it's led to a famine. And one of the factors in that, one of several factors, one of the factors is climate change. So this country, which has contributed so little to global climate change, is already suffering very real effects of climate change. But there's more going on here. So if we come back to our maps for a final time, there we are, and we consider race. So just quite simply, if we look at that first map and we ask ourselves what color skin do people have in those countries with the largest carbon footprints, and predominantly those are going to be white people like me. And if we ask what color skin do people have in those green countries where carbon footprints are smallest, they are going to be predominantly majority black and brown people. And inversely, when we look at vulnerability, is by far and away going to be people of color who are going to be most vulnerable to climate change. Some of that is, yes, to do with economics, some of it to do with geography, but there's also a racial line there, which we can't ignore. And that's why I've written the book about why climate change is racist. But that is a tricky one for a lot of people, because straight away you want to ask, well, hang on a second, how can climate change be racist? It doesn't have any opinions. It's not something that can be racist. But it's important to understand that there is more than one kind of racism. A lot of the time when we're talking about racism, we're talking about prejudice. And we know what that looks like. That's the individual, interpersonal racism. We see this at things like racist football chants, for example, when people boo at footballers taking the knee, those sorts of things. But it's not really socially acceptable in the same way that it used to be, thank goodness. And not many people would kind of openly say that they were racist in that way. But if that's our only definition of racism, then you can very easily dismiss the whole debate. And you can come out with very glib statements like we've heard from some of our politicians this year, when people say things like, well, Britain isn't a racist country. It's not that simple, because there are clearly deeper things going on beyond those personal prejudices. Even though most people aren't going to be openly racist, we have deep inequalities that kind of persist in things like policing, or in healthcare outcomes, or sentencing, or access to education, getting into the best universities, getting into politics in the cabinet, chances of becoming prime minister, those sorts of things. Why do those things persist, even if most people aren't overtly racist? And the reason is that there are deeper forms of racism. One of those is institutional racism. This is a phrase that became quite familiar to us through the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, although it goes back further than that. And they defined it as the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. The two men who coined the phrase institutional racism had a really nice definition that I quite like. This is Charles Hamilton and Kwame Ture in the 1960s. And the example they give is that if somebody throws stones at a black family's windows, that's individual racism. And when that family can't get a mortgage to buy the house in the first place, that's institutional racism. I think that's quite a helpful way of thinking about it. But if you add together all these institutions over time, then you get something even more profound, a kind of deeper level still of racism. And that's when you get to structural racism. And this is a tricky one because it operates without there being deliberate intent behind it. And as the sociologist Howard Winant says, racism must be understood in terms of its consequences, not as a matter of intentions or beliefs. So when we find these strange statistics, like, for example, why COVID-19 affected more people of color, well, obviously a virus can't be racist. It's not possible for a virus to be racist. So why did that happen? And the reasons are structural. There's all sorts of complex reasons that I won't go into because we're talking about climate change, but clearly there's something deeper going on there. And that's what we're talking about with structural racism. And that's how climate change is racist. It's a form of structural racism. It's not about intent. Nobody wants to deliberately oppress people of color through climate change. But by disrupting the climate, it is people of color who are going to suffer more. And so there's a racial dimension there. The Puerto Rican scholar Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls structural racism racism without racists, because it persists without that deliberate intent. And it's because of that deliberate intent thing that anti-racist campaigners often say how important it is to be proactively anti-racist. We could get everyone in the world to stop being a racist, but it wouldn't undo those deep institutional and structural forms of racism. It would just ignore them and they would persist. You have to actively dismantle those things and work towards equality and justice. It's not enough just to say, well, I'm not racist. It doesn't work that way. And one way to pay attention and to be anti-racist is really pay attention to power and how power operates in the world, particularly through things like we've mentioned earlier, like COP26. Who has the power? Who's being listened to? Whose needs are high on the agenda and who's low on the agenda? Because when we look at global power dynamics, there are some very deeply rooted injustices just below the surface that we don't really notice. To bring that out, I want to show you this image here. And if you're lucky, you might have seen this before. I don't think that one of these ever crossed my palms when they were in circulation. But this is a £50 note from a few years ago. And these two serious-looking gentlemen here, one of them is James Watt, and the other is Matthew Bolton, the Birmingham industrialist. And between the two of them, the inventor and the industrialist, they came up with this the steam engine and popularized it. And the steam engine that they designed is kind of the iconic machine of the Industrial Revolution. It's the one that really kickstarted the use of coal in industry and a model of industry that was then exported all around the world. It's iconic enough that if you go to the Science Museum, the Bolton and Watt machine is right there in the center of the Energy Hall there. There's one in the Museum of Scotland. And if you remember the 2012 Olympics, when those huge chimneys kind of rose out of the stadium, a very dramatic moment in the opening ceremony, they had several of these, 5 of these rose out of the stadium as well. So it really is an iconic machine, enough to put it on the £50 note. But what's really interesting about it, I think, is that in order to get those first engines manufactured, Bolton and Watt had to take out a loan from a bank. And the bank that they used was funded by slave plantations in the West Indies. And so right from the start, there was this connection between slavery and the Industrial Revolution. And of course, that doesn't stop with Bolton and Watt. When slavery was abolished in 1833, it was the slave owners rather than the slaves who were compensated for their loss. And the Treasury made this big database of all the different slave owners and what they were all owed in compensation. And it was secret for quite a long time, and then it was made public in 2013, and you can browse it online at UCL. It's a really fascinating data set, because what it shows is who owned slaves and what else they invested in. And you can draw all these lines between slave ownership and then people investing in railways and in factories and in bridges and the infrastructure that really built Britain during the Industrial Revolution. I think one of the big differences between the race debate in the US and in the UK is that in the US, it's very immediate because you have the legacies of slavery and segregation right there on your doorstep in ways that you can't ignore. Whereas in Britain, we always kept slavery at arm's length because it happened in the colonies. We didn't need to see it. We didn't need to take responsibility for it in the same way. And so it's much easier to deny, later on in life, later on in history. But through records like this, you see how close it came to us. And where I am in Luton, the next street along from me is Crawley Green Road, which is named after the Crawley family. And Samuel Crawley is on this database, listed as owning slaves in Granada. Some of you are in Bedford today, and in Bedford you have, in this list, you have the Payne family. Sir Peter Payne represented Bedfordshire as an MP at one point in the 1830s, and he claimed compensation for 92 slaves in St. Kitts. There's another family in Bedford, Sir George Henry Sharp of Adelaide Square, Bedford, was paid for 117 slaves in St. Vincent. And he was an industrialist who invested in building railways in the Midlands. So there's a direct connection between the railways we probably still enjoy in the Midlands, still use, and slavery in St. Vincent. These kind of stories can be found in any town up and down the country. So what we see from this is we see that the money that's paid for industry has a kind of dark origins, if you like, if we stop and look at it. We know that slavery and colonialism and empire were quite openly racist processes. Centuries later, we see those same racial injustices, less openly, echoed in things like climate change. It was the stolen labor of Black and brown people that kick-started industrialization and provided the capital for it. And then the long-term effects of industrialization in the form of climate change get dumped back on Black and brown people at the end of the process. So there's this racial injustice that runs right through the story. A story of
I just dialed into the Climate Change Forum. There's some guy who's got some book and he's just talking about his book. Has he been neglected, Stevie?
Can we remember to mute, please? If you don't mind. Thank
Eric,
you.
could you mute yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you. It's very distracting otherwise. So what we have here is we have a story of white power. And it's important to say that it's white power. There are plenty of white people who didn't have any power in this process. White power taking what it wanted. First people, and then land and resources, and then the atmosphere later. So when we look at this history, we realize that climate change isn't unfolding in a neutral environment. It's happening in a historical context, and that is a historical context which has been shaped by empire and colonialism and by the white supremacist logic that made those things okay in their time. What happens when climate change is added to this long legacy of injustice is that those injustices are compounded and then entrenched for a new generation in new ways. And I think that's what we're seeing when we think about those maps back at the beginning. I want to show you what I mean when I say that these injustices are going to be entrenched in some more practical ways, and how the effects of climate change are going to unfold in the coming decades. So here are 4 different effects of climate change. I'm just going to run through them briefly, because I don't want to take up too much time at this point. But the first one there is heat risk. What this map shows is where the number of days of deadly heat that places are likely to experience in 2050. And deadly heat is when the temperature rises beyond what the human body can tolerate. So your natural mechanisms for cooling yourself, like sweat, for example, can no longer keep up. You can survive deadly heat if you can cool yourself down through things like air conditioning or taking a cold shower or whatever. So it's not immediately deadly. But you can tell, you can think of the kind of risks that you'll be facing if you were out in that kind of heat. You can also imagine how difficult it would be to run a city, to go to work, to go to school, to work in your fields. It would all just become impossible if you have several days in a row of deadly heat. And we look at the burden of places of deadly heat in that map and the places that are most affected. There's not many white majority countries and cities that are going to be affected in that way. Just below that, we have crop failure, closely related, in fact, to the heat risk. And again, we see some parts of the world that are marked in red there that are really going to suffer from reduced harvests because of climate change. In the blue, other parts of the world are going to be largely unaffected by climate change. When we look at that map, again, we see the distribution of risk from crop failure. It goes right across Africa, across India, across lots of places that already have quite serious food security issues. And it's going to make those worse. Up at the top there, we have cyclones. This map shows the path of every cyclone for the last 50 years. What it shows there, of course, is that there are several cyclone basins in the world, places that get cyclones, like in the Caribbean. And I've marked Madagascar on the map there because you wouldn't be able to see it otherwise. And there are other places like us up in the UK that really aren't on any cyclone paths. You get a very rare outlier might come our way out of the Atlantic. But places that are in a cyclone basin are going to be repeatedly hit by cyclones and by bigger and stronger cyclones as climate change moves on. And then finally, this is, I think, one of the most scary graphs in the climate change canon, in my view. This is a map of uninhabitability, and it came out last year. What we see there is that there are parts of the world where if we add together all these things, the heat risk and drought and so on, it just won't be possible to maintain settled communities in the same way. You won't be able to grow crops, you won't be able to raise livestock, and it basically becomes very difficult to actually maintain a way of life in those places. There are a very few places in the world that are like that already, and those are marked in black on that map. They're mainly in the Sahara Desert. The shaded area shows parts of the world that could be uninhabitable in 2070. This is under a business as usual scenario on climate change emissions. I really hope we don't have business as usual. We really need to hope that we don't maintain the level of emissions that we have at the moment, because there are 3.5 billion people living within that shaded area. That's an almost unimaginable number of people moved off their land, no longer able to live there. You have a migration crisis unlike anything seen in human history. The vastness of the human suffering and animal suffering as well, to be honest, involved in that shaded area is frightening, really. It's a striking image. And yet again, if we were to ask what color are people living in those areas, there's only one majority white city that I could find in that area, and that's Darwin in the north of Australia. Otherwise, it's almost entirely going to be black and brown people who are most affected by that. These kind of findings are backed up by a report called the Climate Vulnerability Monitor. And they estimated that by 2030, which is not very far away, the global south would bear 80% of the economic damage of climate change and 99% of the mortality. And another way of thinking about that 99% mortality is that we may have 99 black and brown people who die from climate change for every one white person affected by that. And you can see the starkness of those sorts of figures. And you can see why we have to talk about that question: do Black Lives Matter? Or will we consider them expendable the way that they were in previous eras under colonialism and under empire? And these are hard truths, I recognize that. But perhaps you can see at this point why I've talked about colonialism and empire in a talk about climate change, because I think this is the great injustice of our time. And just as previous generations had to consider things like apartheid or ending the slave trade, or choose whether or not they would stand with the civil rights movement, for example, I think that where we stand on climate change is the big challenge for people alive now. Are we going to play our part in that? Or is it going to be another sorry chapter in a long history of exploitation along racial lines? On the more positive side, just to wrap up, the intersection of climate change and race has been overlooked, I think, in climate change discussions. And when I came to start researching this and writing it, probably about 6 or 7 years ago now, I couldn't find any books on the topic. And that's why I wrote one, because I couldn't find the book that I wanted to read, and I ended up writing it myself. That's not true now. There are several different books out there, either being published or coming out next year. And the most exciting thing, I think, is the way that there are several movements now that really get this. The Sunrise Movement in the US is one. The movement for a Green New Deal really understands how social justice and the environment can go together in some new and inspiring ways. And I think the Fridays for the Future, the school strike movement, are really explicit about calling for anti-racist reparations for climate change. And that's a big and influential movement. And if you had said to me 5 years ago when I was starting working on this book, that there would be a global movement of young people demanding anti-racist responses to climate change, by the time the book came out, I wouldn't have believed you. So we've come a long way in 5 years. And I think this conversation is rising up the agenda, and more people are willing to have it and talk about it. And actually talking about it is the most important thing we can do. It is complicated. And that's why we need to talk about it openly, not be defensive about it, be willing to be challenged on it and see where we come to. And that's why we'll make time for questions now. I'll stop sharing. And we can open it up to whatever questions you might have.
Jeremy, that was really interesting, such an important subject. Everyone feel free to type any questions or comments that you have in the chat. While you're doing that, I'm going to start off with a question. So mine is really thinking about globally, but also locally. So your maps are so striking, aren't they, with the sort of correlation of race and biggest impacts of climate change and minimal input to the causes of climate change. But what about sort of more locally? So in Bedfordshire, there's also a sort of racial aspect, isn't there, of people, as with COVID, people being, impacted more negatively. Do you think that's the same with climate change locally here, for example?
Yes, I think there are all kinds of local effects to this as well. They're much better documented in the States than they are in the UK. There's a well-established environmental justice movement in the US. They've been researching this stuff for decades now. The environmental justice movement came out of the civil rights movement. And so from the 1960s onwards, there have been people who've been looking at how Black communities are often living nearest to toxic waste sites, for example, more exposed to road pollution, those sorts of things. We don't seem to have done that kind of research in the UK in the same way for a variety of reasons, but absolutely you will see localized effects. One notable example is in London, for example, where you've got Black communities who are disproportionately affected by air pollution. Air pollution out of Newham is, I think, the most multicultural or most non-white borough in the whole country. And it's right next to the London City Airport, which serves like the richest London elite flying in and out to their businesses and so on their private jets, and dumping the pollution from those planes onto, London's most non-white borough. And it's that kind of thing where you think actually these things are localized as well. And we don't tell those stories very often. And it would be interesting to see some more research in the UK into how that happens. I have a friend who's a Muslim, and he says that mosques in the UK, because they were built often after the town was already built, they found themselves buying pockets of land that were affordable. And so they ended up on more marginal land and often right next to very busy roads, or next to industrial estates and so on. And so that meant that children who were going to Islamic schools ended up breathing air pollution that they wouldn't have breathed otherwise. And so we get these sorts of localized effects as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. An interesting question from Mark. What scale of financial or otherwise reparations are required to address structural climate racism fairly?
It's almost impossible to put a figure to it. We know that back in 2009, the African countries decided they were going to negotiate as a bloc at the Copenhagen talks, and they had put a minimum figure for adapting to climate change of £200 million a year, $200 million a year. That was rejected. It became 100 billion, and for the last 10 years, 100 billion has been promised and never delivered. What has been delivered has often been delivered in loans. So even when it comes to climate adaptation and a very watered down figure, we still haven't been able to deliver that. The loss and damage, we haven't even started that conversation yet. I couldn't really begin to estimate what it might be, but we're not even having that conversation yet. And you mentioned how that whole debate was sidelined at COP26. But there was one little bright spark there, that was the Scottish government, that was the first government to say, we recognize that Scotland, small though it may be, has had a disproportionate impact on the climate, and we are therefore responsible, and we will put $1 billion on the table to this loss and damage fund. Who's with us? And it turned out that nobody was with them. No other rich countries were willing to follow their lead, but well done Scotland for making their mark on that one. This is a debate which will rumble on for decades to come, because it has to be addressed at some point. It's not going to go away.
Good for Scotland. Julian's got a question. Julian, do you want to say your question rather than me read it out for you?
Thanks, Lucy. Sorry, it's quite long, but I'll read it as quick as I can. Thanks very much, Jeremy. That was a brilliant explanation. It made it really very, very clear. So I'll read it out. So discussions about reparations for slavery, and I know this from personal experience, do meet a good deal of resistance, especially on social media. And David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, as recently as 2015, asked Caribbean countries to move on, which I think we'll all have a similar sort of view on. And our current Prime Minister talks about the fall of the Roman Empire being due to immigration. It's clearly a very clear dog whistle there to a section of people. But it'd be interesting to know your views. What do you think the best way to pitch climate change reparations or loss and damage to the public is? I mean, apart from basic fairness and equality. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's two different things there. The immigration question and the loss and damage question, and pitching it. It's worth talking a little bit about immigration first, kind of almost separately, I suppose. But I think when you look at that map of uninhabitability, it's hard to escape the idea that climate change is probably going to be the biggest driver of human migration in history. So if we look at the biggest people movements in human history so far, I think probably the biggest is the hundreds of millions of people that moved from rural China to urban China in the last century. The biggest single incident of a mass migration all in one go is during the partition of India, and that was 20 million people. But on this map of uninhabitability here, we have 3.5 billion people who might be affected. Even if it's half as bad as that, or a third as bad as that, we could still be looking at 1 billion people on the move in the coming century. The effects are going to be both ways. There's going to be these people who are moved off of their land, and who are going to lose their homes. And then those people are all going to go somewhere. And where are they going to go? What kind of welcome are they going to get? Where on earth could we accommodate 3.5 billion people or even 1 billion people? It's a horrendous thing to think about. And we know the kinds of politics that emerges, the kind of politicians who will speak up and get elected when immigration becomes a hot topic like this. And I think this is going to be a debate which will, in 10, 20 years time could be really defining for my kids' generation, perhaps when they come to vote for the first time. How are we going to treat refugees from climate change, especially given that we caused them to move? That's something. How can we respond compassionately? And the second thing is what can we do to make sure that it doesn't happen in the first place? How can we make sure that people can stay in the places where they live, which is obviously what everybody wants. Nobody wants to be moved off of their land. And this is where there may be a possibility of framing loss and damage and money for adaptation in ways that will cut across some of these political divides. If climate change is going to be a major migration issue, it's not enough to just build walls in a Donald Trump style and say, you're not coming in. It's completely unethical, but it's also impractical. If we can say instead, look, we need to take responsibility for the fact that we caused this damage. We are causing people to lose their homes. We need to stop that by cutting our own emissions. We need to keep people in their homes as much as possible. Stop making it worse and give people the money that they need to adapt, compensate them when they move, and maybe as a global community, we can begin to address this risk. If we don't do that, I think it is a fairly horrendous situation in 40 or 50 years. But if we can frame it right, perhaps there's a chance that we can prevent it from happening.
Thanks, Jeremy. Does that answer your question?
That was really good. I mean, sometimes I do despair, but I really like the fact that you retain that optimism. And we've got, even if we don't succeed, I'm sure we've got to try. It's the best we can do.
Yeah.
So Colin has a question. Colin, you can read your question, can't you?
Yes, sorry to bestall that. Going back to your map of the actual responsibility in the different areas of the world, I was wondering, is that really related to current rates of emissions as opposed to historic responsibility? Because I'm imagining that in Britain we have a huge accumulated responsibility, given that we started the Industrial Revolution and we've been living on coal.
Yes, that's right. So those are current emissions, just for ease of comparison. But sometimes in talks, I do go into the historic emissions side of things. And when you look at historic emissions, the impact of the US and North America and Europe combined is, vastly, vastly greater than, even China. China would have a long way to go before it catches up with America and its emissions. And Britain's role in industrial history means that we have a huge carbon account behind us that is disguised, as you say, when we just look at current emissions. That's an important factor when we talk about, when we come to global negotiations on climate change. The poorer countries can always say, well, your emissions have been carrying on for 200 years and ours have been carrying on for 50 or 60 years. You have to take responsibility for the whole lot, because this is a cumulative process. Emissions stay in the atmosphere for a long time. So you've got to look at it in that historical context. Yeah.
So kind of echoing Julian's question a little bit, if I can follow up. Can you imagine how our actual politics might evolve so that we can admit the historic damage that we are so sort of overwhelmingly and horrifyingly culpable of?
It's really difficult. It's difficult because it's such a long process. And it's difficult because those of us who, are living now and who have to take responsibility for climate change, we're not the people who went around the world and claimed half the world for the British Empire. We're not the people that used coal power even, by the time I lived in Britain, we had moved on to gas and we were beginning to wean ourselves off of that kind of thing. And, it feels like we're being accused of something or handed something that we didn't help to, to create. And that's, we have to take responsibility for it without accepting blame for it. That's one part of it. In terms of the politics that emerges, it has to be a long-term process. And I think it has to be a matter of discussion. And I think one of the most interesting ways of thinking about it is along the lines of a truth and reconciliation process. Like we've seen in some parts of the world where there have been genocides, or places like Australia and New Zealand that have tried to reach settlements with their indigenous communities, where there's been a dialogue across different groups, and people get to tell their story, and you can come to a new kind of understanding. And I wonder if there's going to be a truth and reconciliation process of some kind, certainly between colonial countries and colonized countries, and that might get rolled into climate change discussions, or it might be separate, I don't know. There are good examples of countries that have come to terms with a difficult past, Germany being the most prominent one. And it feels to me like there needs to be a process like that, and a bit of a reckoning. It will be different for the States than it is for the UK. For us in Britain, it's all about the empire, and for the US, it's very different. I wonder if one thing that might help to tip us towards that discussion is when the Queen dies. I think that will be a time when Britain examines itself again and remembers its empire, which was there when the Queen came to power and isn't so much there now. And as we come to look at what defined, the second Elizabethan age, it will be a time of the winding down of empire. But because the Queen's been a kind of continuity all through that, we've never looked at it as a process, and perhaps we will in the coming years. I don't know. It's hard to imagine how that politics emerges, but it's not impossible.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Colin. Hilary has a question, which I've just lost. Do you want to read it out, Hilary? I've lost it now.
Yeah. It's really to do with the idea that many migrants to rich countries send money back home. I wondered if it's comparable to the billions that the rich countries are meant to give anyway. And that's it acts as a bit of a balance, and is a reason in a way to have more migrants, because they will target their money to the people and it won't be taken up by corporations in between.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. The flows of money from the diaspora of Africans working in the West, the flow of money from those people back to Africa is larger than all the aid given by the rich countries to Africa. So an awful lot of money does flow that way already. There's a economist, I think she's from Rwanda originally, called Dambisa Moyo, who wrote quite a famous book called Dead Aid a few years ago. And one of her big things was to say, actually, you know what, having international students, people on short-term visas, work permits, those sorts of things, who can come and work and send the money home, is a far better way of doing those transfers of money than having everything controlled by the bureaucracy and the political priorities of governments. Some people disagree, because what tends to happen is that it is people who can afford to send a child to university in the West who will then get those jobs, and so the money is going back to a fairly elite family, whereas aid money is going to go to the poorest. So there's swings and roundabouts in that. But yes, there is a good case to be made for having more guest workers, is a good way of thinking about it. And some countries use that term rather than immigrant workers, people who are here to work with the expectation that that money would flow back again. It's definitely something that can be factored in. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. I was thinking about sort of gender issue as well. For example, women sort of facing the brunt of, you know, the worst effects of climate change in the global south.
Yes, it's an interesting thing, because I've written the book about climate change and race because there wasn't one. But there's all sorts of other injustices that you could equally take apart and look at in the same way. There are books on climate change and how it affects women. You could also look at intergenerational injustices. Any group in society which is marginalized is going to come out worse because of climate change, because it just compounds the difficulties that you already face. In Britain, you know, we have an issue with coastal communities, for example. Some of Britain's coastal towns are really neglected. They're geographically marginalized. They've seen their traditional industries kind of dwindling away, and so they're quite poor. And now they're going to face greater risk from climate change and from winter storms and those sorts of things, from sort of encroaching seas. So it's often the people who are already at the margins that get hit hardest by climate change. That's true globally for women. It's true for older people, people with disabilities. You can imagine what it's like if you're in a situation, in a flood situation, and you're disabled, or if you're in a flood situation and you're a nursing mother with a baby and you've got to swim to safety with a baby, whereas the man might be at work, and it's a totally different situation. There's lots of situations like that where those risks fall hardest on people who are already marginalized in other ways. And climate change is kind of this big multiplier of disadvantage. We're still unpacking all the many ways that that's going to unfold. But this is why it's so important to think really hard about how our responses to climate change can work for those who are marginalized. So just to give a really practical example, you could, if you had 100 million to spend in Britain today, you might think, well, let's subsidize solar panels. People could put them on their roofs. So you might do a feed-in tariff, for example, make it easier to get solar panels on your roof. But that's going to benefit house owners and people with money to spare to put solar panels on their roof. So straight away, you're talking about middle-class homeowners. If you took that 100 million and you put it into better buses, for example, electric buses, let's say, that's going to benefit people who don't have cars and who ride the bus. So straight away, you're benefiting the poorest. You're benefiting people who can't drive because they're not old enough to drive yet. So you're benefiting children, for example. If those are electric buses, there's less diesel pollution in those poorer parts of town where people live next to busy roads. So all of a sudden, same money spent in a different way, and you've spent it in a way that benefits those who are marginalized. And that's how we need to think about climate change and our response to it, so that we are proactively beginning to dismantle those injustices.
Excellent. So many important issues. Before we wind up, anyone else, by the way, please do type a question in. We've got a couple of minutes. But what's the response to your book so far, Jeremy? I know you've done a few talks and it's been out since June or July. Obviously, you've got an audience who are engaged with climate justice and social justice. Have you had any negative kickback from certain circles, or do we not need to talk?
I have had some kickback from a few people. I mean, people who don't accept climate change, for a start, are often people who also don't accept structural racism. So they have two reasons to get upset about the book, and they're the ones who've caused the most trouble. I had a brief campaign to give me 1-star reviews on Amazon. I know the guy who was behind it. That's been a mercifully small group of people who've responded that way. Overall, I think it's just a really interesting conversation that not everyone agrees with me, and that includes Black activists in the States who I quote in the book very positively, who've come back to me and said, you didn't quite get everything right, or maybe that wasn't really your book to write, and we disagree on some of those things. I think the main thing is to have this conversation and to be prepared to be a bit uncomfortable with it, because it is difficult, and it is difficult as a white person to talk about race. I'm not going to get everything right there. I don't have any personal experience in racism, so I do feel like I'm on unfamiliar territory. It's been a real learning curve. but has been a really interesting conversation to be part of. Yeah. Can I just say as well, people who are asking about the presentation, if you go to my website, the Earthbound report, there's a page there that has all the graphics that I've used in the presentation. You're welcome to use them in presentations of your own and so on. So if you just go to www.earthbound.report, you can get the graphics from there.
Brilliant. The graphics are amazing. Question for Mark. Mark, do you want to read out your question? This can be the last question of the night, I think.
Well, Jeremy always gets a version of this question for me, so I'll ask it again for the benefit.
I know what it's going to be about.
you can see this coming. I mean, I'm just making the point that there's more money flows back from the global south to the global north than overseas aid ever managed to do, because of the way the whole structure is set up, and therefore that brings me back to my three-legged stool, sort of degrowth, climate justice, or climate racial justice, if you want to call it that, and global governance, or my hobby horse, the World Parliament. I think the stool doesn't stand unless we address all of those. You answered the last time saying you agree, but you don't know how to get to proper global governance, and I still haven't got an answer for you for that either. But we probably need to engage with organisations like Democracy International, World Without Borders, those sort of places, to try and promote a better functioning United Nations, for instance.
Yeah, like you say, we've talked about this one before, and there's, in an ideal world, we would have a global government that could solve this. I have two hesitations over that. The first is that if we were to create a global government now, we know who would be most powerful in shaping that global government. It would probably reflect all the same inequalities that we already have. So we'd have to be very careful about how it was set up, so it was actually useful and doing the right things. And the second problem is that it's just almost impossible to imagine how we would get to a global government when we have some of the most powerful countries like China and the US that are so skeptical of the relatively powerless structures we already have, such as the UN. So I hope that my kids will be able to have this discussion and have better answers than we do about whether it's possible and how we get there, because I think some form of global governance would be really helpful. But it's hard to imagine from where we are now. But keep asking the question to me and to other people as well, because it is something that we need to talk about, and we tend not to even get beyond this idea of competing nation states. We have to get beyond competing nation states. If we can at least get to cooperating nation states for a little while, maybe in a few years' time, we'll get to global governance. So keep asking the question.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for another wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everybody. Some really interesting questions. And I think this is such an important subject. I think we all want to go away and talk about it. The recording will be on our YouTube channel. I've put the link in, and that will be there in a day or two. So it would be great if you could share it in your networks. And, I think we've talked about really interesting issues that have kind of raised, who is seen as having value, who has responsibility, and what we can all do to really sort of pursue and follow up this question about responsibility and social justice. Things are changing, like you say, Jeremy. The conversation has changed over the last 5 years because of Black Lives Matter, and we need to do that so much more. So it's been a real privilege to have you. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. So I've put the link to our website as well, and also our Twitter. Of course, you can get Jeremy's book from the Earthbound website, or from
yes, there are links there, and bookshop.org is my favorite platform to buy it from, rather than from the world's richest man.
Yeah, if you buy it from Amazon, you won't be welcome back to on. Just saying that there's no excuse at all. Bookshop.org or Hive, they're often as cheap as Amazon as well, and they're really quick, so there's no reason for that. Anyway, I think we all have quite strong feelings about that, don't we? Yeah, but buy the book, recommend the book. I think Julian's just got it on Kindle. So he'll be reading that, bedtime reading. So yeah, spread the word. Let's keep the conversation going. And we will be back. If you're on our mailing list, you'll get news of our next events. We've got a couple of things penciled in the pipeline, one about nature restoration and another possible about an energy expert from Cranfield. So keep an eye out for those. And thank you very much. And thank you again, Jeremy, for being brilliant, really fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Colin.
Okay, a pleasure, Lucy. Did we get Mohammed Al-Ramahi coming? You emailed him, didn't you? And suggested that
But
he...
I don't think he did. Shall we stop the recording, by the way?
Yeah, oh yes, apologies, yes. Oh yes, let's do that.